Have you ever witnessed the chilling moment when a narcissist starts channeling you? Let me take you into something that sits right on the edge of the psychological and the uncanny, something I've come to call narcissistic channeling. The phrase itself sounds like it belongs inside a paranormal documentary, and honestly, that's not far from how it feels when you witness it. I first used the term after a woman shared a story with me that stayed under my skin long after she finished talking. She had gone to a family reunion, her first in many years. Family gatherings, for her, had always been emotional minefields, places where she felt she had to brace herself for impact. But she went anyway, partly because she missed the connection, partly because the people who had made those gatherings dangerous were now gone. One of the people at this reunion was her niece, someone she had never actually met. The girl was the daughter of a sister she had cut off many years earlier. This sister, now passed away, had been what she described as a malignant, vulnerable narcissist with a con artist streak so sharp it could cut through steel. For decades, this woman's sister had manipulated fragile relatives, drained partners dry, used future promises like poker chips, and pulled people into triangles she controlled like a puppet master. Cruelty was her default, and she wielded it like a tool. Even as a child, she had been dangerous in a way no one wanted to admit. The breaking point came when the woman discovered that her sister had swindled $50,000 from a cousin who was barely surviving as it was, leaving the cousin's life in absolute ruin. Their mother, who had always enabled the sister's behavior, downplayed the betrayal, smoothed it over, made excuses the way she always did. And in that moment, something inside the woman snapped. She realized that if she didn't protect herself, the psychological damage might become irreversible. So she made the painful choice to cut both her sister and her mother out of her life entirely. The extended family reacted predictably, guilt-tripping, shaming, accusing her of being dramatic or cruel. But in time she realized the truth. That boundary was the only thing that restored her health, clarity, and emotional stability. While her sister lived with their mother and bled her dry in a never-ending loop of dysfunction, the rest of the family blamed the one person who refused to play along. She vaguely knew her sister had a daughter. The girl had been raised by her paternal grandparents after her sister went to prison for fraud when the girl was 14. But because this woman had cut ties with most relatives and avoided social media entirely, she knew almost nothing about her niece's life. By the time her mother and sister both passed away, she had spent years cocooned in peace and distance from the chaos she'd escaped. So when a cousin happened to run into her one day and invited her to a family reunion, promising the environment would be safe and that the toxic crew was no longer part of the picture, she found herself saying yes. She felt older now, lonelier, more aware of time slipping by. She wanted reconnection. She didn't even think about the possibility of seeing her niece. When she arrived, she described the atmosphere as unexpectedly grounding. Faces she recognized from decades ago, softened by age, kids running around, warm smiles from relatives she once adored. She felt, for a brief moment, like she had stepped into an alternate universe where everything was normal. But then she saw her niece walking toward her. A cold wave moved through her body. The resemblance to her sister was unmistakable, not just in the shapes of her features, but in something deeper, something she couldn't easily name. Still, she told herself to stay open. The girl wasn't responsible for her mother's sins, and as they spoke, the niece seemed pleasant, polite, curious, even warm. She chatted about her job, her home, a recent vacation. On the surface, nothing seemed wrong, but the woman began noticing small things: a certain slant of the head, a tightness in the smile, a cadence in the way she formed sentences. Tiny gestures, but hauntingly specific. She said it felt as if the ghost of her sister was flickering behind the girl's eyes. The reunion stretched across the whole weekend. On the second day, during a group conversation that started off playful but grew heated, something shifted. The niece became animated, then agitated. Voices rose, opinions collided, and in that escalating tension, the transformation happened. Not slowly, but sharply, almost violently. The young woman's tone changed. Her posture snapped into rigidity, her eyes hardened with a familiar fire. The woman described it as if her sister had stepped straight into the room, wearing her niece's face. the righteousness, the manipulative edge, the explosive volatility. It was all there, emerging like a specter from a sealed vault. She said the resemblance was so precise, so nauseatingly exact, that she felt the air leave her lungs. Memories she had buried came rushing back with the force of a nightmare. She told me it felt horror film level uncanny, as though her past had briefly resurrected itself in the body standing before her. That night, overwhelmed and shaken, she quietly packed her things and slipped out a day early. She wasn't angry at her niece. She made that very clear. She felt compassion for the young woman, even sadness. What she couldn't tolerate were the echoes, those ghostly remnants of her sister's behavior that had seeped into the niece's mannerisms, not because of genes alone, but because trauma has a way of leaving fingerprints on those who grow up in its shadow. She told me she didn't blame the girl. She simply couldn't confront a new version of an old ghost. And it led to a question she asked with a kind of quiet resignation, one I've since realized many people whisper to themselves but rarely say out loud. Have you ever met someone, a coworker, a relative, even a stranger, who carried the same energy, the same emotional frequency, the same unnerving behavioral blueprint as a narcissistic person from your past? As though patterns can float through the world like smoke, drifting from one generation to another, long after the original fire has burned out. Let's sit with the family dynamic for a moment, because this is where the experience can take on a strange, almost supernatural edge, where it feels as if a narcissistic person has been summoned right back into the room through someone else's body. You might watch a sibling suddenly slip into the tone or posture of your narcissistic parent without even realizing they're doing it. A nephew or niece might repeat a familiar cutting remark with the same twist of the mouth that once came from a narcissistic aunt or uncle. Sometimes it's even more haunting. A grandchild begins showing flashes of the same emotional intensity or manipulative energy as a narcissistic grandparent who has been gone for years. Before your rational mind can make sense of what's happening, your body reacts. Your stomach tightens, your shoulders brace, your breath shortens. It's as if the atmosphere in the room shifts a few degrees colder, and you realize you're not just reacting to the person in front of you, you're reacting to the ghost they resemble. But none of this is literal channeling. What you're really witnessing is the complicated blend of genetics, temperament, and what psychologists refer to as social learning. Certain things, like a gesture, a smile, a particular laugh, or the rhythm of a sentence, can be inherited or shaped by the temperament we're born with. And when those traits belong to someone who hurt us, it can be unsettling to see them appear in another person, or even in ourselves. Biology doesn't care about history. It simply replicates what it replicates. Deeper than these natural similarities, though, is a more powerful mechanism at work. The person who appears to be channeling the narcissistic family member may not just resemble them physically or stylistically. Under stress, they can slip into the exact same emotional reactions. This doesn't mean the channeler is a narcissist, but because they share not only genetics but years of observing the narcissistic person up close, they've absorbed certain survival behaviors. When they feel cornered, threatened, overwhelmed, or desperate for control, their nervous system may reach for the responses they saw modeled throughout childhood. In those moments, it can feel eerily like the original narcissist is speaking through them. This channeling often shows up most strongly in people who never fully understood or were never ready to face the narcissistic dynamic in the family. Some minimize it, some justify it, some stay in denial for decades. I once heard a story from a woman about her twin brother, someone she adored and trusted, who absolutely refused to acknowledge that their father was narcissistic. Even as the father aged and slipped into dementia, the brother chalked his lifelong cruelty up to stress, old age, or a hard childhood. He had spent his entire life trying to win the man's approval, chasing something that had never been available in the first place. When the sister finally learned about narcissism and tried to develop a plan for their father's care, her brother exploded. His voice, his expressions, the cadence of his sentences, all of it became so identical to their father that she said it felt like he had stepped back into the room. She told me that if she had closed her eyes, she wouldn't have been able to tell which man was speaking. Terrified her. It felt like watching a horror movie where a familiar spirit slips into someone you love. That moment changed something inside her. She still loved her brother, but the outburst left a crack in the relationship, a subtle distance she couldn't bridge. It felt to her as if the father energy was living inside him, waiting to break through whenever he felt threatened. She found herself grieving the version of their relationship she thought was safe, grieving the belief that she and her twin were immune to the toxicity they grew up with. The loss was quiet but devastating. What's even more unsettling is that channeling doesn't only happen in relationships that were already strained. It can burst through in bonds that once felt steady, loving, or completely safe. And in families where someone is raising children with a narcissistic co-parent, this phenomenon can be especially painful. A child, sometimes barely old enough to tie their shoes, sometimes a teenager navigating their own identity, sometimes a grown adult, can suddenly slip into the exact tone, argument style, or manipulative strategy of the narcissistic parent. Parents describe this shift as deeply disorienting, even re-traumatizing, as though they're being forced to relive the relationship they are still trying to recover from. A single phrase, a familiar glare, or an old tactic delivered in a new voice can yank them back into the past so fast that it steals their breath. And it doesn't matter whether they stayed with the narcissistic partner or left long ago. The emotional impact feels like a shockwave, a reminder of how deeply those patterns can travel through a family system. For many people, moments like these feel like their deepest fear suddenly taking shape right in front of them. And right behind that fear often comes a wave of self-blame, parents torturing themselves with the question of whether their choices, the decision to stay or leave the narcissistic partner, somehow shaped how things turned out. They replay those old crossroads over and over, wondering if picking the other path would have kept their child from echoing the very traits they tried so hard to protect them from. This kind of regret is heartbreakingly common among people who've raised children with narcissistic co-parents. Even kids who saw the narcissist's behavior with their own eyes may still end up siding with them. Their loyalty can persist for reasons that have very little to do with choosing sides. Survival instincts, rebellion, unresolved trauma bonds, or the simple pull of staying close to the parent whose mood feels like a moving target. And once that bond forms, the child may begin to adopt not only the behaviors but also the tone, the defensiveness, even the emotional cadence of the narcissistic parent. Something that can feel devastatingly unfair to the parent who tried their absolute best to create safety. The term channeling isn't technically accurate, yet it captures the emotional truth better than any clinical label. It describes the eerie moment when someone dear to you, someone who is not the narcissist, suddenly slips into the exact expressions, reactions, or verbal patterns of the very person you worked so hard to detach from. The only comparison that comes close is a scene straight out of a horror film. The gentle character whose face and voice suddenly shift into something dark and achingly familiar. People describe feeling their stomach drop, their skin prickle, and their heart race because, even though they know it's not real, it feels as though the narcissist is somehow alive inside this other person. And while they don't stop loving the channeler, whether it's a child, a sibling, or a partner, the fear is real because the body responds to emotional danger long before the mind reasons its way through it. The real explanation is far less supernatural. People internalize what they grow up around. And when you combine that with temperament and genetic predispositions, it creates the perfect recipe for familiar patterns to emerge under stress. When the person who channels becomes overwhelmed, threatened, or emotionally overloaded, those old reflexes, those learned survival strategies, spring up like muscle memory. Everyone in that family system was trained in the same emotional language, even if they hated it. So when the channeler mirrors the narcissist's behavior, it often feels like an exact replica, not a faint echo. What's difficult to acknowledge is that most people who grew up around narcissistic parents carry some of those traces within themselves too. Maybe it's the defensive tone that slips out before you catch it, or a moment when you hear yourself saying something manipulative or dismissive without meaning to. Those moments can feel like a moral jolt, a reminder of how deeply childhood scripts can embed themselves. This is why self-awareness, self-reflection, and self-compassion matter so much. They function like quiet, ongoing deprogramming. They help you peel back those layers without drowning in shame when they resurface. The key difference between someone who slips occasionally and someone who channels intensely is simple. You recognize it and want to grow past it. The channeler often doesn't. That's because people who channel strongly are often still wrapped in denial about the narcissist. The adult child who mimics your narcissistic ex might still be fiercely protective of that parent, unable or unwilling to see the harm. The sibling who suddenly takes on the tone of your long-deceased parent may still cling to the belief that the parent was simply strict or complicated, not toxic. That denial keeps the behavior alive. You can't dismantle something you refuse to acknowledge. Life with narcissistic individuals already carries the emotional weight of a suspense or horror film. But seeing this kind of channeling, especially after the narcissistic parent or partner has passed, adds an almost surreal layer to the experience. It can feel as though some part of them continues to echo through the family, resurfacing at unexpected moments. And this can complicate grief in unexpected ways. The loss never fully settles because reminders of the narcissist still show up in the living. This phenomenon isn't limited to families. Workplaces develop their own versions too. A new manager may step in, but certain employees continue to act or make decisions exactly as the previous leader did. Without the deep emotional ties of a family system, it doesn't hit as hard, but the effect is similar enough that you might find yourself thinking, why does it feel like the old boss never left? People model what they've learned, even long after the original influence is gone. All of this can be deeply unsettling. Your body reacts first. Your chest tightens, your vision narrows, you feel dizzy or dissociated, before your mind has any chance to rationalize what's happening. When that happens, grounding yourself becomes essential. Slow your breath, anchor your attention to your surroundings, and remind your nervous system that you are safe. Channeling doesn't automatically mean the relationship is doomed. Sometimes all it requires is clearer boundaries, more distance, or a new way of engaging. What truly matters is understanding the phenomenon itself, recognizing when and why it happens, and accepting that people who remain in denial about the narcissistic individual are far more likely to reenact the behaviors that wounded the family in the first place. When you name this experience and understand the psychology underneath it, the fog begins to lift. The moment shifts from something supernatural is happening to this is what trauma, learning, and family systems look like when the echoes are still alive. And that understanding alone can make an eerie moment feel far less disorienting, giving you back a sense of grounding in a situation that once felt ghostly.